Hello and welcome to the Hindu's live interactive webinar on COP29 that we call COP29 Tracker. This is the second week of COP29 that's taking place in the oil-rich nation of Azerbaijan, its capital Baku. Now, increase in the first week, there was considerable deadlock on one of the main pain points, which is to pivot developed countries from the $100 billion pledge that they made at COP Copenhagen in 2009 to trillions of dollars as G77 and China have asked for each year. Now, increasing attention aside from this has also been particularly around the crucial issue of oil and gas and the future of energy. Following intense discussions at COP26 in Glasgow, if you all recall, where coal phase down was a focal point, there is now growing pressure on developed nations to take more aggressive action on reducing emissions by phasing down the use of oil and gas, which really propels most of their economy now. But how realistic likely is this shift, especially with gas still being considered the bridge fuel in an energy transition? Meanwhile, oil and gas producing countries like Azerbaijan, indeed, where the Conference of Parties is taking place, has a response and a stake in it. So, how will this country respond? Aside from this, the nationally determined contributions, which are voluntary, have been updated by some countries. The United Kingdom, mainly as a G7 nation. It's also expected to be updated by Brazil, a developing nation. So there's also growing pressure on other countries. So to discuss all this, I have with me the Associate Director of Energy Transitions of WRI Energy, and a former colleague, I have to caveat over here, Tirthankar Mandal, who's actually just come back from a week of being at Baku. Tirthankar, thank you so much for joining the Hindus COP29 tracker.
Thank you, Kunal, and thank you for that introduction. So, I'm looking forward
So
to this
let's
conversation.
jump in. Yes, just let's jump into this conversation. As you know, as we've told our viewers, and we've had very robust participation in this in the past week. People would ask questions, so there is a interaction with our audience. So if I can first open with the question that I just asked, how realistic are the developed nations in phasing down oil and gas, particularly because it's considered a bridge fuel?
So, let me just take a step back before actually I address the realistic part of the question that you have said that so long back, long back in months back, Brazilian President Lula actually formed this trioca, right, with UAE, Azerbaijan, and the next COP presidency, which is Brazil. The intention is to actually carry forward the low emission actions in various countries, including these countries which you just mentioned. So UAE is also a
Oil
gas
rich nation.
emitter, oil, fossil fuel rich, and all of these things. Same is Azerbaijan now. And in that context, it is becoming more and more clear that energy transition, whenever you take it, it's not a question of just replacing one fuel type by cleaner fuel types. There are lots and lots of nuances in it. Now, coming in that connection, what this COP is actually focusing on, and as we have said and seen, quite a number of articles has been written and reports came out in the just a week or week a month before the COP, is that everybody is calling it as a finance COP. What does it
Yeah.
mean really is that everybody expected that the finance goal or finance commitments from the developed countries needs to be there, put in place, or maybe I would rather say that it is an ambitious goals of finance needed to be there. But
Yes.
essentially, after the first week, it is like nothing has progressed. Only we have discussed about what's not to be there rather than what ought to be there. So
Right.
that's kind of a position that we are in. But I am basically hopeful of the fact that it's not different, that much of a different from other COPs, because in the end of next first week, it's the negotiators who are negotiating. It's not the political leaders who are actually going to come and basically thrash out the divides. But one thing is for certain over here is that we are discussing finance numbers in trillions. So it is not this year, it has been the trillion number is not the calculations of this year. It came out even last year as well, when the NK Singh and Larry Summers report actually projected that we need 3 trillion for SDG, out of which 1.8 trillion per year US dollars has to be from 2030 onwards per year, has to be for only for climate actions. Now
Right.
we
Right.
even in this year's, in the mid of the first week, Stern, Mr. Mukhopadhyay, and one more researcher has came out with a new report which actually talks about 1.3 trillion US dollars per year from 2030 onwards. But in
Right.
between, what has happened is that the 2022, you started off with the Copenhagen declaration, Copenhagen summit declaration and all. The Copenhagen summit actually said that the developed countries had to meet the goal of 100 billion by 2022, but it has been pushed to 2025, and thereby after 25 every year you have to make 100 billion in the kitty. But we are yet to reach 100 billion. But
Right.
OECD
I
report,
thought we
we can
crossed that once in 2022, right? Yeah.
exactly, we crossed it. But if you remove the public private financing part of it, it's very unsettling to see those numbers. I won't get into those numbers. If the
Yeah.
question comes up, I will say. But the crux of it is that, as I said, it's about the gap which is remains. It's about the need is in trillions, but we are only getting into billions. And I literally, like, hoping that somehow the ministers who are going to come and the G20 summit which is going to happen, these two kind of enablers can actually enable some kind of a positive outcome from this COP.
Right. So, yeah. So, like you said, this week is a crucial week because actually it's not the negotiators, it's not the back end or backroom folks. It's actually the administrative executive, the political class, which actually descends at COP and might actually be making those crucial decisions. So, historically, the presidentship of COP, as you rightly pointed out, just like the way the Dubai COP had a sort of a long shadow of it being the first nation which was an oil-rich nation and a historically fossil fuel producing country and exporting country holding COP. Similarly, Azerbaijan, in fact, I think is the second and consecutive nation to do so, and in fact, 90% of its if its revenue comes from oil and gas. Um, Given that it is in a nation which is oil rich, how do we, what is their stake in it, and what is their position, and how do we see them shepherding these conversations?
I think the main issue over here is about how do you finance the energy transition, right? Even if there is a even if the presidency, there is a component of leadership into it, but also there are more than 190 countries who are part of it. It's not just the presidency. So even if a presidency is a oil rich and everything, so everybody had this in mind that when it was happening in last year, that what will happen, the outcome
Yeah.
of the last COP. But we managed to get a decent outcome. But this year, I think, again, with, as I said, it's the other countries and the other leaders who are more important in this conversation. And one thing I kept on hearing during the first week is that it's much more like we need to get into a positive frame of mind in terms of conversation leading up to the ambition, right? So if you, and
Yeah.
that's where the leaders are for, right? And that's where the several other directions that are needed and that are already been provided. So one of the major thing that happened, one of the more of the positive thing that has happened is on the sides of the carbon markets related discussion. So there was,
Right.
that was a major sticking point for a long period of time, at least 3 or 4 cop like after Glasgow till last year it was kind of a deadlock. But this year we actually achieved a lot of it, like at least the standards, how it should be done and all of those things. I think
Yeah.
people can actually take, and there are some headrooms between the nations as well about working out opportunities on it. So it's not just about the Azerbaijan presidency, it's about the other countries as well and how they will actually work towards it. Coming back to the transition part of it, as I said, it's more of the developing countries, how they are going to actually make this transition happen, and how
Yeah.
the others, the developed nations of the world, are actually going to support this transition, right? And over there, as I started off my remarks by saying that there is a finance gap and we need to recognize it, and one way or the other there is also a subtle recognition. I think these are all negotiating tactics, because somehow we feel that, like, we from outside felt that, look, if the ministers actually come and sit together across the table, these gaps could actually be thrashed out, and that is the hope that we are having. And also one more thing, the other thing is that in terms of this energy transition, I would actually say that we need to take into account that you can actually do a lot more in the developing countries, but the cost of energy transition is much more higher. It's actually double. The cost of capital is actually double in the developing countries as opposed to the developed countries. This is we are not saying it, it's the IEA report of 2024 is actually saying it. So if
Yeah.
we go on those yardsticks, it has to be sorted out, like in terms of
Yeah.
energy transition, in terms of renewable energy deployment, and all types of things. So the finance is one part of it. The other part of finance is actually access to technology. All these technologies has to be provided at an affordable rate, and thereby also the cost of capital also kicks in. So
Yeah.
unless and until these are the things which actually is the extra negotiation kind of discussion which are happening, and I see there is a lot of movement across it. And if you actually see the discussion going around, like within the cop, outside or within the pavilions and all of those, the pavilions is an area where these several bilaterals actually are happening between the business as well as in within the government. There
Right.
are momentum actually within in these terms. So actual outcome we might not actually see in the in the agreements or any sort of things, but we will definitely see them on ground. So that's the hope we have.
Right. So as you began there, this is being dubbed the finance cop. It's all about how much money can be pledged towards ultimately climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and particularly for the developing countries. And to enable that, the new sort of goal that has been set is this, what's now being called the new collective quantifiable goal, which is again, the pivot from that 100 billion. And as you said, it already appears to be something of a compromise. I mean, you didn't say that, but considering what you pointed out from the Larry Summers reports, right? Like the trillions that he'd sought, and then scaling it down to 1.3, at least by what the developing countries are asking for. To those who've been viewing the finance conversation, this might appear to be a bit of a cop out by developed countries, right? Like, one is because the developed countries are saying, hang on a bit, we're still at the 100 billion level. Secondly, yes, we are historical emitters, but at the same time, let's become proportionate about who are the current large emitters. So they should also cough up. So they're trying to ask India and China and other developing and emerging economies to also begin coughing up money. Thirdly, they're now saying that they will sort of subsume grants and loans and all the various other types of financing mechanisms within this sort of NCQG, that's being considered. And lastly, if I, from some of the conversations I've had, it appears that this might even have the loss and damage component subsumed in
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
So, so it really, to someone who is been observing this, it almost appears as if like the developed countries are saying, look, like we just cannot pay up anymore. I mean, and that's a very grim situation, isn't it?
So let me uh, just clarify a point over here is that NCQG, this whole concept, this fund or this need for this quantified goal that has been proposed over here, it actually covers everything. So you this goal will actually have like three or four, like it will have fund for adaptation, it will have loss and damage, it will have the mitigation targets, whatever the fund is going to be supporting, all of those things. Now,
Right,
and that 100 billion and whatever the scaling up happens, and you are correct, like the need is actually in trillions, and that has been scientifically, technically, and financially been established in all forms. So it's not just the NK Singh, Larry Summers, or Stern, or Mukhopadhyay, or any other. Actually, these are not two or three reports that has actually came out, but there are others who are actually, like the IEA report also says that, right? So
right,
even
right,
before that, IRENA came up with this report, which is basically saying that you need maybe 30 to 40 trillion US dollars in 2030 and at several points of time. So these trillion numbers are not new. Everybody knows about it.
right,
But the fact of the matter, the point of disconnect over here between the parties is that what is the form of this money or
monies. Yeah,
contribution is
yeah,
going to be, and
yeah.
there you will actually find a kind of gray area between the countries, or particularly between the developed and the developing countries, because the developed countries are trying to say that, "Ki, look, I will consider all forms, including my private companies who are putting money, but that
I
can,"
see.
and the countries on the other side, the developing countries, are saying, particularly the who basically need it in the form of grants and non-loan forms, they
Yeah.
are basically saying it that, look, you better tell it what is loan and what is like
What is
grants
grant?
and
Yeah,
other
yeah.
forms,
What is, yeah.
exactly, which is a,
Right,
which I think from a different perspective it's a fair ask, but at the same time, the scale of this gap is very stark. If
right,
you are contributing in billions but your needs is in trillions, I am not sure whether the private finance ecosystem can actually meet up to the trillions or not, because that's a big question mark on that. Because incidentally, the private finance community is also like looking up to this cop very eagerly to actually see, because in within the NCQG, one of the most important things that the parties are actually discussed in the first week is that what are the kinds of enablers that you need to put in, and what are the kinds of disablers you need to be aware of in the
right,
mitigation
right,
actions and in the contribution part. And that
right.
is where your investments and all sorts of private capital flows are going to
Yes,
be either enabled or multiplied or whatever. But I would actually like to say one point, even among these two famous reports. One is the Stern report, which came out in the middle of the week, and another one is the last year's report. The
yes.
private finance has been pegged at 500 billion in both the reports,
I
even
see.
though even
500
though
billion
500 billion US dollars per
million.
year, billion,
B with a B. Okay, yeah.
yeah,
500 billion per year by just the private financiers. Okay, that's a tall
yes,
ask. I mean,
exactly.
yeah,
So
yeah.
this is per year from 2032 onwards. This is not even now. This is per year 2032 2030 onwards, and both the
Onwards.
reports are coincidentally pointing out to one number, like they have reached the same number from both the types of things, but there is a difference in terms of how much total capital is required. These two reports, one of the report which came out last week is saying that 1.3 trillion US dollars per year by since from 2030 onwards. So,
Yeah.
and the other one is 1.8 trillion. Now, the gap over there is like what is in there for the LDCs and the small island states and all of those
Small
things
island
is that,
states.
look, if you, it's really in the terms of energy transition, how this transition is going to be made affordable for them, because
Right.
you see all these energy technologies are like, whatever way you put it, these technologies are getting cheaper, but at the same time your cost of lending in these countries are getting costlier, as well as
Higher. Right.
countries are putting different sets of standards as well. So standard,
Right.
it's no more the, no more, it is no more like the non-tariff measures are not the new kind of trade barriers, the standards are the new trade barriers in the new world of climate change and all of those things. So these are the new sets of barriers and new sets of things that the LDCs and other countries needs to take care of. And we like the people over there who care about these countries development and all of those things, it's even if it is a development first narrative, which is for all right reasons, which is should be the case, I think we need to deal with the economic cost plus the non-economic cost, which includes these standards and other measures, becomes
Yeah.
quite higher even for getting these technologies, right? So
Right.
I mean to say that if you don't get, say, a efficient technology in solar, you might actually attract your carbon standards on your products or on your systems. So how do you deal with it for a LDC like say who is very rich in producing textiles and all of those things? How do you actually do with those things? So those are the kind of issues that then actually follows. So these are the things that we need to take care, we need to consider, and I think more analysis and more requirements are there, and that's where I think the we are moving towards that direction in the future.
Right. Okay. So it's interesting you said what the disablers are. You said the disablers are actually the standards that are being. So is there a way to work around that, considering something that could be tailor made for LDCs and small island states and others, where we are not so stuck on standards as opposed to what they might be their unique needs? One. Secondly, in terms of governance, you've actually handled governance extensively at WRI. In terms of governance, how would this the allocation of funds and then the disbursement, and to what end? For instance, you said certain things would be for adaptation, certain would be, or certain for, say, technological transfer. How would that governance structure work? I mean, are these conversations also taking place?
Yeah, I think that is part let me come back to the governance issue first, because that is essentially the part of the enabling mechanisms that the NCQG discussions are happening within that. And the other part, interesting part, is that in that there is a huge component of how the in country, like the domestic allocations or domestic arrangements are to be made. So that
Right.
actually plays a very vital role, not just in the developed countries but also in the developing countries as well. And particularly, you mentioned in the beginning that there are these big emitters, current big emitters like India, China, Brazil, South Africa. So they have a robust system of governance to some, as compared to the LDCs and all. The major issue over here is that the lack of bankable projects, one, which is actually disablers, and then,
I see.
as I mentioned about the standards, right? These
Right.
two are the broad categories of issues that the countries are dealing with. And why I say this is actually going to, in a way, facilitate investments, because in even if you are going to invest even beforehand, you are aware of it, that look, these are the set of issues that I am going to deal with it. Currently the investment community
Yeah.
is actually beating in the bush, because for them they don't know what are the kinds of uncertainty they are going to face in these two buckets of things, right? So this is where UNFCC, or this common group that is discussing about these disablers and enablers, can actually play a very vital role in terms of energy transition. Remember, we have the goal to actually triple the renewable energy capacity by 2030, and if we actually do a good job of disablers, I think
Yeah.
we can actually enable the investment community to come and invest and meet that 500 billion target, whatever that is there. The governance part is also very important, because currently, apart from the national level, the subnational level components are very weak currently in terms of
Right.
these
Right.
kinds of actions and access to these international funds.
Right, which
So
becomes really crucial,
exactly,
particularly, yeah, for like smaller
and
countries. And yeah, yeah. Go
exactly,
ahead.
and these enablers part in the discussion of the NCQG would actually facilitate a lot in kind of giving guidance to those kind of frameworks. Ultimately, it's going to be the mechanisms and frameworks which will enable it for unlocking various kinds of funds.
Right. Right. We're almost, we started late, and I apologize to a lot of our viewers, to all of our viewers. We usually do this for half an hour, so I'm just going to quickly do a health check to see if we have comments or questions. There are some comments. Um, not so many questions yet. So I think I'll just ask one final question, which is, I'll come back to the hopeful note which you sort of brought in, which is the carbon markets, right? Again, from a governance point of view, um, it this has been going on for a long time. This conversation on carbon markets has been going on for a long time, and the main issue has actually been governance, right? Like, how do you apportion credit correctly? For instance, right? Like, if the emitter works on compensating for his or her emissions, or their emissions, say in the United States, by attempting to create a carbon sink in Indonesia. Does which country or which region then inherits that carbon market? Or
Yeah.
all these this is just like a very layman's
Yeah.
way of looking at
So
it,
I
but
would actually make a much more generalized kind of observation, like rather than taking this specific, what is the issue over there in the carbon markets is actually two types of issues. One is that there are two main articles where this discussion is happening. One is Paris Agreement Article 6.2 and Paris Agreement Article 6.4. Now, 6.2 allows for bilateral carbon markets, whereby you can actually, two nations can, the example that you gave, those two countries can bilaterally trade. And 6.4 allows for international trade of carbon credits, right?
right.
Now, in both the cases, the danger is actually your greenwashing. The one that we have seen in the case of CDM, various CDM projects, which
Yes.
necessarily didn't actually have the expected effect of carbon emission reduction, end up getting more than their carbon credits, right? And that is
Right.
what essentially, to avoid it, we created these two articles has been created in a way. And now, once we have that agreement of standards in the 6.4, the UNFCC technical bodies are now going to identify the detailed elements of it, which will make it a robust set of indicators and all of those things, by various sectors and all of those things. We don't get into detail, but essentially it will create mechanisms by which we can avoid those earlier mistakes that we have made. That is point number one. Point number two is that now that essentially will feed into your 6.2 discussion as well in indirect manner, because think of a situation, if I am Indonesian government and I am having a huge amount of carbon sinks, after
Yeah,
meeting my NDCs, I can actually sell it to the market, right? After, so carbon markets are important. You need to actually meet your NDC and then go to the carbon market. You cannot do it
I
both
see.
at the same
Right.
time. Now, if you actually do it in that way, what you essentially do is that you have the choice to go to the international market or you sell it bilaterally. Now,
So are we
there
going to
is a,
actually? So does this mean there's going to be a sort of a trade? I don't know, a carbon trading exchange. Like, how
it's
does?
essentially an exchange.
Yeah,
So you have currently, you already have these voluntary carbon markets which are essentially exchange, and their prices
exchanges.
go up and down seasonally. So these Googles and Microsoft actually buy those carbon credits from their market. So there in within that there are lots of those market credits that I just alluded to, which amounts to greenwashing. And this, the parties actually wanted, particularly the developing country parties, which are
Yeah.
interested to actually avoid this greenwashing, right? And
Right.
then that is the reason why the 6.4 discussion took so many years to actually come to a agreement on what standards and how the standards and mechanism should be developed. And on that, actually, if I am hopeful that once these 6.4 discussions are going to be further taken up in the process of the carbon market discussion, they will also some, somehow need to figure set up commensurate standards or commensurate indicators that will actually not be in contradiction with the 6.4, because that
Okay.
is very important. Otherwise a country will have two sets of carbon credits, one under 6.2 and one under 6.4.
One which is bilateral and one which is.
Yeah, which is infeasible for it, because it
Yeah.
has
Yeah.
same, like it has probably 2 lakh acres of forest. 1 lakh acres of forest can go under 6.2, another one, it
Yeah.
just doesn't seem
Doesn't make
practically
sense.
possible,
Yes.
right? So
Yes.
some linkages will be developed in that way.
So there's much more room to actually fine tune, and we're going to
Yeah.
probably see in the next coming months and maybe years
Yeah,
how
so
this.
major thrust is going to avoid this greenwashing, and people are actually people, not people, the parties are actually very careful to draft it in a manner so that they don't get into the same problem that they have faced it in the 6 months in
Right.
the CDM market.
Right. Well, we are out of time, and I just wanted to sort of like close by saying a lot. There has been a lot of skepticism about COP29, particularly because of one, the fact that it is being consecutively held in an oil-rich country. Secondly, the fact that several of the world leaders have not actually have decided not to attend COP. Some of the most consequential of the countries have decided not to attend COP. But this week is the crucial week when all the heads of state or whoever is in government is going to come and participate. So it's probably still early to decide that there hasn't been much movement.
Yeah.
But at the same time, thanks so much, Thankar, for joining us and enlightening us with this, with all your insight and with what you had observed at Baku in Azerbaijan. And thanks to our viewers who've been tuning in regularly to watch this COP29 tracker. And I do hope that they tune in again and follow us on their favorite social media platforms. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kunal, for hosting me. It's a pleasure.
Thanks. Bye bye.
Bye.